Theological Pipe.
I've been expecting you.
There is a God, and
I speak German.
I'm talking.
In the light of the majesty of creation, nobody cared. Those are the first two lines of a poem that I'll probably never finish, called Nobody Cares. And I know it's going to be ironic or hypocritical for me to sit here and say nobody cares when I tell you what that poem is about, or what that poem would be about if I finished it. My wife and I and my son and his girlfriend a few weeks ago went to the Smoky Mountains on vacation for a week in Tennessee. And we went to different trails and hiked, and as always are in awe of the beauty of creation, of the majesty of creation. There's something about the mountains, at least for me and for most people, the mountains, the ocean, creation, it kind of just draws people into it. And it was amazing to me. I'm used to going to Colorado. Normally, my wife and I, when we take trips every year, every few years, we normally go to Colorado, go camping, go fishing, go hiking in the mountains in Colorado, the Rocky Mountains. And when you normally go to the Rocky Mountains, when we go, we would drive our car up a trail somewhere, up a road, find a trail, stop at the trail and just walk. And when you hike in the Rocky Mountains, in the places that we would go, like Pagosa Springs or Durango, different places in those areas, you can hike on a trail for miles and not see anybody else. And it's beautiful and it's amazing. And again, love the Rocky Mountains, love Colorado. But this year, we just decided we were going to go to the Smoky Mountains, and the Smoky Mountains are different. They have a different feel to them, no less beautiful. I'm going to say they got their name because when you go to the mountains, there's clouds that kind of cascade over the mountains looking like smoke, and it's beautiful and it's amazing. But the difference was in Tennessee, when we went to the trails, there were hundreds of people with you on the trail. We went to this first trail. We were going to go to a waterfall, and we drove my wife's Jeep up the mountain, up the trail. We were following the directions that we were supposed to go to. And as we got close to where we were going to get off and go hike up the trail, there's cars everywhere on both sides of the road. And when you get up to the little turnout where there's the parking lot for about, let's say 20 cars, it's completely filled. And so I'll say probably for a mile, there's cars on both sides of the road, and everyone's getting out and they're walking to that trail to go see the waterfall. I think it was Laurel Falls. I may have gotten the name wrong, but we found a parking spot fairly close. Someone had just left. We found a parking spot. We get out, we walk, and as we walk the trail to the waterfall, there's people behind us, there's people in front of us, there's people walking with us, and there's people walking back from the falls. It didn't make it any less exciting. It was still beautiful. We still were in the mountains. But as we got to the waterfall, instead of just you being there looking at a waterfall, there's 50, 100, 200 people sitting there taking pictures, and you kind of get the view, and then we walked back. Again, I was still in awe of God's creation. It was an amazing time. And so the next day we did a different trail, and this one ended... was a shorter trail. It was kind of in a bigger spot, and as you walk to the end of the trail, there's this big kind of like circular walkway that goes up to this observation tower. And as we're walking up this, that's when I sort of noticed that, again, there were tour buses in the parking lot, hundreds of people just walking around. Now, as we walked up this short trail to get to the observation tower, we went off on our own for little hikes and little paths that nobody was really walking on. And got to see some amazing sights, and then we'd come back to the trail. And it's as we're walking up to this observation tower that it kind of struck me how many different types of people I saw. And it started when I saw, I'm going to say they were probably 10 to 12-year-old, a baseball team. And they were all wearing T-shirts and their baseball pants and their hats. And their T-shirts said something like, all Jewish League from like Alabama or from another state that traveled to Tennessee just to play in a tournament, and they were hiking. And it just struck me like that's not something you see every day, in Oklahoma where I'm from. I was born in New York, so I kind of am used to that kind of stuff. But when I'm walking, I'm like, okay, there's a whole group of Jewish baseball kids running around, looking at the mountains, looking at God's creation, and it's amazing. And then it started to hit me. I'm like, there are Japanese people here. There are Chinese people here. There are black people, white people, Indian people, people from all different countries, because I heard them talking and they weren't talking English, and some of them were, and some of them had accents. And it was amazing to me because what you had in Tennessee is all different types of people, all different races, all different creeds, all different sizes, all different shapes, all different sexes. I mean, you name it, the differences were so, like, it was, when I noticed it, I was like, oh my goodness. And as I walked, it kind of struck me that even though the media and the politicians and everyone these days tried to divide people, at that moment, nobody cared. Nobody cared about political ideology or race or gender or age or sex or anything like that. We were in awe of God's creation. And I've talked before on this podcast about how, I don't like when people try to divide people into these groups, this intersectionality thing that's going on where you have to be part of this group. And if you're part of this group, you're privileged because of some oppression that you might have come. And if you're part of this group, or you're guilty because of whatever, and it's dangerous, and it's a silly ideology. There's one group that we all belong to, and that to me is people that are made in the image of God. I've talked about the Imago Dei. We are made in the image of God. God created us male and female. He created us in His image. And at that moment on that mountain where people were walking, nobody cared about the divisions. Nobody cared about intersectionality. All they did was they were in awe of God's creation. And that's where I started to come up with that idea for a poem. Again, in the light of the majesty of creation, nobody cared. And I think that the poem could just be those two lines. I was going to say, nobody cared about your political ideology. Nobody cared about your race. Nobody cared about whether you were a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. Nobody cared about where you were born. Nobody cared. We were all in awe of God's creation. And I think it just was one of those things where I was like, that's something that brings people together and helps us realize that we all share in that Imago Dei, that we were all made in the image of God. And in the light of creation, if you want to get away from the division, if you want to get away from feeling the stress and the anxiety of just life and what's going on, man, go back to nature, go to creation, go to the mountains, go to the hills, go on a hike somewhere, go to the ocean, go to a lake. And for me, every time I get back to something like that, I'm just sort of, all the other stuff just goes away. And it was amazing to me at that moment that the same thing happened, not just to me, but to everybody I saw, regardless of who they were, where they were from, where they were coming from, what they believed in. We all just stood in awe of the majesty of creation, and at that moment nobody cared. And so I think that's just something I wanted to share. I thought it was a poem I'll probably never finish. In the light of the majesty of creation, nobody cared. Put that in your theological pipe and smoke it. We'll see you next time.
Well, bye.